Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you'll let us know where you think we got it right and where we totally missed the point, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com. Now let's get into it. So what do you want to talk about, Brian?
Well, we would be not doing a service to anyone if we said we were going to talk about all the pertinent issues of the day, and we did not talk about abortion. And for those who are not, those of that we're talking to who are not old enough yet or not alive yet as we're recording this and listening to this as they kind of look back upon this point in history, it's not okay right now for Dave and I to even be talking about abortion. I don't think. I'm pretty sure it's outlawed because we are men, that we're not allowed to have an opinion on this. So that's the first thing people need to know, I would say. But what else do you think is the pertinent part of what's going on with this one, Dave?
Well, this one's interesting from not just the issue itself perspective, but it's interesting from the how people reason and get to their point, and where such a significantly contentious attitude exists on both sides. It may be that in the future folks look at it and they think, well, isn't this a question of science? Isn't this just a question of logic? And why was this such an issue back when everybody was yelling at each other about it?
Right.
And I think that's a good question. I think that's a fantastic question. And to me, it really comes down to a sort of a philosophical moral question. So that's sort of the top of the component of it. And then the next question down is what government involvement should there be in that question? And so at the beginning, at the top, what you've really got and I want to represent this in a fair way, right? I don't want to come across, I am pro-life. This is my position. I believe it is logically arrived at, and it's the most scientifically and logically sound position. So I'll just say that right up front. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that what we've got are two sets of rights in conflict. That's really where the issue is, because the pro-lifers have a point about rights and the pro-choicers have a point about rights. It's not as if this is an issue. And the reason this one is so contentious, I think, is because it's not an issue where you've got 100% right, 0% right. It's not like that. What you really get to summarize the whole thing is you've got on one side, the pro-life position says that a human life is a human life whenever, and human life needs to be protected because human life is the most important right that exists. So that's one side, and that's a legitimate thing. On the pro-choice side, what you can say, which is also legitimate, I want to acknowledge that, is that human choice, liberty is a fundamental, basic human right. Yes. So what have you got here? You've got two human rights that are both true and that are both valid, and they're in conflict with one another. And one of the most important things we need to understand about law and history and philosophy is when you have two true things that are in conflict with one another, that's when you have to engage in some deeper thinking. And so hopefully through this episode and demonstrating to those in the future where this might already be resolved. I mean, maybe in the future, why are we even talking about this? We've solved all these scientific issues. We can, we can take 1 second after conception and put it in a dish and grow a baby, stick it in the factory, and it'll produce widgets. Who knows?
IVR is going to have a whole new meaning in the future, probably. I would imagine
it could very well be. It could very well be. So, to me, it seems like it's important to define both of those positions and then compare and contrast. If we're going to get to a reasonable conclusion, and right now, you and I having this discussion is. Yes, it is a little bit strange because you could put two people in a room that have opposite opinions and say something and they both start, just arguing with one another as opposed to reasoning together. And I think that's what we need to do in this issue.
Yeah. And I think of the things we've talked about so far, many of them have been more binary than I would like, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I believe that there's much more nuance in many of the conversations you and I are going to get into, but some of them do kind of come down to, very binary as far as values. This one,
Yes.
it's like a sliding scale to me. I think everyone believes that protecting human life is important. And there's literally from conception until literally maybe an hour now, depending on which news stories you listen to, as far as how late, quote unquote, abortions are happening. And in some cases being reported that life is being terminated for babies being delivered, and maybe even up to an hour or so later. I don't know how much truth there is to that, and that's not really important here, but somewhere between conception and delivery, or an hour or so after delivery, that 10 and a half months or whatever that could be, somewhere along the line, we all kind of decide that becomes a person. And for
Right.
some people, it's at conception, and some people it's not until the moment of birth. And for many people, I would say the majority, and I don't have any scientific data to back this up, this is my perception and my opinion. I completely could be full of crap here, but my perception is that the majority, the 80% of us kind of in the middle on the political spectrum, would say somewhere that's not exactly conception and somewhere that's not exactly birth, this becomes a baby, a person. And it's no longer a zygote with it has no emotional and can't feel pain, and like is like a petri dish thing too. It's a person now. And I think that's because there's so much nuance, there's so many variables. There's the what ifs, what if it's rape, what if it's in, there's so many like different nuances and variables that I think it gets really confusing. So I agree that there's a scientific portion, there's the human element, there's the legal element, there's just a lot to this topic. And I think the first place to start is where I started for us, is just, why are you and I able to talk about this or not? And my opinion is that even though I'm obviously not a woman and I've never given birth and never will, I don't feel bad having an opinion about this, because I have opinions about lots of things that I don't do or would
Absolutely.
never be capable of doing. And I'm okay with people who don't own guns having opinions about guns. And there's lots of things I've never done that I have opinions about. And every person who lives in our country and on our planet has opinions about things that they can't do or won't do, or are not completely 100% relevant. So to me, that argument doesn't hold a lot of water, but I know this is a very passionate one. So let's just start there. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think I'm full of crap on that perspective?
Well, so on the question of whether or not you're allowed to have an opinion on something, I think any domain of knowledge anybody can have an opinion on, or reason their way through. So I discount immediately as disingenuous anybody who says because you're not this, you can't have an opinion on a subject. So
Yeah.
I discount that as somebody who's just being not.
I'm not in an
truthful.
interracial marriage. I'm all for interracial marriages, though.
Right, exactly. I mean, I can have if I'm not allowed to have an opinion on anything having to do with females, then about half of the world is foreign to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
maybe it is anyway, but I don't know.
So the again, for those listening in our part of our audience, if for doing this podcast is talking to people who are adults around the year 2080, and I think, Dave, you and I have decided to call this person like Kenny G. And the reason he came up with that, so when you hear us talk about Kenny G, we're talking about this person who is born around 2040 ish. And the reason we picked Kenny G is just because that is Generation Gamma. As of 2023, that's been determined to be Generation Gamma. And talking about Generation Gamma didn't seem like it was really easy. And Kenny G is the first thing that popped into our minds. And so Kenny G's who we're talking to, he's the guy who's an adult around the year 2040 or 2080 or so. He's probably about 40 years old then. So people listening who are alive with us today in 2023, when you hear us talk about Kenny G, that's what we're talking about. And the reason we're talking to him is because this is a great example of there'll be no shortage of archival stories to go back and read, and news clippings and legal things that are happening. But one of the things that Dave and I don't hear people talking about is what the mood is like now. And this is one where it is possibly the most contentious, but we said that on every single episode so far, so I don't know.
It's all the most contentious.
This one is like where people just like really get heated and like really get vicious, I would say, and from all perspectives. There's not one side or one angle or one group that does that. Like, people really get vicious about this one, because I think that, and the reason I think that happens is because it's at at the core of their values, which we've spent a lot of time talking about. We won't get into that too much today, but it would be interesting for people to know in the year 2080 that two men would not be allowed to talk about this. Now, maybe in the year 2080, guys like me and Dave have been wiped off the face of the earth, and it's the law of the land that you can't talk about this if you're not a woman. Who knows, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
So let's take the legal part. So let's just start with the legal part. And one of the things I hear, I agree with you 100%. One of the things I hear people say very often is, this is not the government's business.
Right.
So, and I support that, except for the part where murder is the government's business. And at some point, if we deem this a person to be a person at 20 weeks or 15 weeks pregnant or whatever, and that if they have the same rights, then, so for example, to give some legal context, there are states and places where you can be convicted of double homicide if you kill a pregnant woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so the law is saying in some cases that this is a person, and it would be wildly conflicting to say also that this is a person if somebody they don't know kills it, but if somebody they do know kills it, it's okay. Like that does not seem congruent.
Right. No, exactly right. And I think what we get to in the legal from the legal perspective, in the governmental perspective, for instance, in the state of our society right now, for the folks in the future, to explain kind of what has happened, the state of our society right now is to determine a governmental standard at which abortion is no longer appropriate. Now, the most ardent pro-life people would say that is conception, because that is when a baby, a human offspring is born, and humans are innately valuable. On the flip side of that, there are those, in fact, I'll modify something you said earlier. There are those from the more progressive philosophical perspective who would say that it's when a child achieves sentience. So the upper end of that is there's a professor from, I think it's Princeton, Peter Singer. He's well published and he's out there for a long time. And he said, look, the logical place where a human being becomes a human being is when they become fully sentient, which is about 3 or 4 years after birth. So his perspective is philosophically, and well, I mean, yeah, wow, exactly. But if you think about it, that's a consistent perspective with logic. If you believe that sentience, if you believe that there is an arbitrary spot at which a human becomes a human, pinning it at sentience is probably more logical than pinning it on the moment that the child emerges from the womb, because I mean, you're just talking difference of location here. You're not talking any qualitative difference in this person, in this being at this point.
Sure.
I mean, the current argument right now is that it should be probably, or part of the current argument is that it should be probably when a child can feel pain, when a human can feel pain. Now, all sorts of things get wrapped around this, like, okay, is it a fetus? Is it a baby? Is it a zygote? Is it an embryo? All these different, but all of that really from a philosophical perspective, from a scientific, that really, I don't think is logical and really matters. So all of this gets to the question of human life being innately valuable and when should you protect it. But that's actually, I would say, Brian, that's the second question. That's not the first question.
All right.
The first question is this. If you grant that human offspring needs to be protected, and you push down the road a little bit that this, the question of when, the big question is, which is more valuable, human life or human liberty? And that's back to my first point of this idea of both of those being fundamental human rights, and why we shouldn't, neither side. See, this is, I think, how we get past some of the contentiousness, if we could. I don't think we can, but if we could.
Not in this current moment, I don't think we could. Yeah. In 2007, I think we had a chance, and I'm guessing around 2033 we'll also have a chance.
Yes.
I am also, a part of me just says this is just a particular topic that may not be resolved for decades. This is such a hot button issue.
It is.
But I hope I'm wrong, and I hope cooler heads will prevail someday.
Well, but see, this is again where I think that's an important point. Cooler heads. If we can get together with one another and say, you're pro-choice, I'm pro-life, I believe that let's just take one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
In that formulation, and I put a lot into the wisdom of the founders. I appreciate the wisdom of the founders.
I agree.
They said, well, first you got to have life. And once you've got life, but even a slave has life. So it's not a great life. Yeah. Liberty, okay, well, now you've removed slavery. Now, it took us about 80 years to do that in this country before we really did that after the founding. And then pursuit of happiness or property ownership, doing, things that enhance yourself. But there's a real hierarchy of rights there. Now, and so this is where, to my pro-choice friends, I would say, look, I agree that you have bodily autonomy, and you should have bodily autonomy, but only in so much as it does not harm another person or take another person's life. Yeah. So I have bodily autonomy, but if I don't like the sweater Brian's wearing today and I slap him with my hand in my bodily autonomy, that's not okay. That's not right.
Right.
So I think we have to deal with those things and come up with a conclusion there. And then we can start dealing with the questions of, when does human life begin? Now, I think if everybody decided on a common point that human life begins, I think the whole discussion is over. Because I think most people, probably 90% of people would say, and this is, this contradicts like Dr. Singer's, a statement that, a human isn't a human until it demonstrates sentience, which is a very, it's an objective, but it's a subjective.
That seems odd for me, but okay. I understand his point, but it's hard. It would be hard for me to find a place to agree with that.
Well, it's horrible. I mean, it's the basics. That kind of thinking ultimately leads you to eugenics and saying certain lives are quality. And, when you and I are in our 90s or 100s and we're senile, then you just because we don't have sentience anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So it leads you to all sorts of horrible things. Even though it's logical, it leads you to all sorts of horrible things. So I think if we come to those conclusions, then we can discuss all those things like you were talking about earlier. We can discuss, well, what about rape and incest? I'm more than happy as a pro-life person to discuss rape and incest as exceptions to whatever rule comes up, as soon as you establish a rule. But you got to establish a rule before you can establish exceptions.
What do you think? So, and this is kind of where I've landed, like that. There's no in my world on this topic. There's just not going to be a perfect solution. There just is not, unless the society becomes either very religious or very not religious. Like the idea that everyone's going to agree on this just seems like an impossibility, like literally an impossibility in a world where I think a lot of things are possible. This is one where I think unless we become a very fundamental Christian or Muslim or religious, whatever country, or the opposite of that, like the idea that we'd have 300 million people agree with this doesn't seem likely. But so if we could carve out that, like, hey, we're not going to have a lot of agreement philosophically or spiritually or religiously, like whatever, or the opposite of those things, right? We need to have one legally. And if we just said, like, I'm just going to pick an arbitrary number, 15 weeks pregnant. From 15 weeks and a day forward, they are a person. This entity is a person, and 14 weeks, 6 days, and earlier they're not. That seems, in the legal sense, the only way in my mind to begin having continuity in the law, at least, right?
Yeah,
and at least a fundamental belief for the people who say this is not the government's business. They should not be involved in this decision. I agree, except for if you tell me an hour before delivery you can still abort this child. Like that, in my world, in my brain, that's just like, that's not reasonable. And I think most people who would say this is not the government's business would also have some version of that. It might be a day, it might be a week, whatever. So my point is, at some point we all recognize this becomes a person. I think, again, 80% of us in the middle. Forget the fringe 10% at each end of the spectrum. 80% of us in the middle are going to say, at some point, this becomes a person. Once we've deemed that this becomes a person by whatever means it is, there's a heartbeat, they can feel pain, like whatever.
Yep.
That, like, it settles. Is that too simple? It feels to me like that would just at least solve this legal problem, not the spiritual problem, but the legal problem.
I think that is from a governmental societal progress perspective. I think that's the way it is. That's the way it is going right now. I mean, because you're right. Yeah. I think I don't remember the numbers, but there's like 80 or 90%. I think it's like 80, 85% of the public in general across, all ideologies believes that, 9 months is too long, 8 months is too
Yeah.
long. I think there's general agreement like the 12. And if you think about it, the United States in our current place is a bit more extreme than Europe is. And Europe
Yeah.
is thought of as the bastion of liberal democracy,
Right.
where in most places it's like 12 or 14 weeks. So yes,
Yeah.
and that's why I
And
also
again,
said it.
it could be 10 weeks, it could be 8 weeks. I mean, to me, like I would want a scientific reason that I could support. But if my version was when they have a heartbeat, and let's say that's 12
Yeah,
weeks, and somebody said we're going to do it 10 weeks, I could, like, from a legal standpoint, I just wish there was continuity. I just
yeah,
wish there was a line. And again, what I'm talking about is having a declaration at a federal level, like a
yeah,
person is a person when, and then
right,
still allow states to do what they want. Some states could have abortion up to that point. Some states may not. I'm all for that. Again, I'm
yeah,
all for Oregon having their trial at doing things their way, and Texas doing things their way, and let's see
right,
which idea is best. Like, I'm all for
yeah.
that kind of stuff, and I'm all for the states having that. But just to have the continuity of the legal system saying a person is a person when just seems like the only place to even begin making a bit of progress on this.
Yeah, and I think that is the way that progress gets made. I mean, from my perspective, I would ultimately argue, and this is again where I started off, and I separated the philosophical moral question from the
Yeah,
governmental legal question. From a
yeah,
philosophical moral question, I would argue for a conception perspective, but I recognize that you're not going to
yeah,
get everybody on board. Now, I do think that when you remove the hardship from the woman from carrying the baby to birth, that will, and I think scientifically, I think it's only a matter of time before science does that. I mean,
yeah,
we have, as in terms of viability has been getting earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier
yeah,
for quite a long time. And it's not a stretch, I think, scientifically to assume that in the not too distant future, for better or for worse, we're going to, and I think for better, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Viability will be, oh, I got pregnant yesterday. Let's go to the doctor and let's, put the baby up for adoption, even though it's a little bit of cells right now. And
yeah.
'cause there you go. So I think
Yeah,
that's,
I saw something. I don't know how. I don't. This was a week or two ago, and it's kind of sort of related to what we're talking about. But it was basically, it showed kind of a Matrix style um area where just like these pods were like the
yeah,
child, the zygote or the embryo or whatever. Forgive me for not knowing the clinical terms, but was removed and put in this thing where it would grow all the way for the 10 months that it takes to
right.
grow a baby. And it felt very stale and clinical and
Yeah, yeah,
robotic, and like the opposite of what like, how could the child develop on the attachment to the mother that we
right.
all had known for our history up to this point in the world.
Well, and that's why I say for
Anyhow,
better or for worse too, because
yeah.
it could lead to a sci-fi dystopia when you can grow babies
Yeah,
in labs. So
that's now, again, speaking to Kenny G, he might be looking at me and you going like, "What? Well, listen, dummies. Like, look at how many
that's how I was born.
miscarriages there were versus there's none now." And we figured out if you pump sound into the pod at this hertz or megahertz or whatever it is, and you vibrate this stuff, like, you can replicate them. Like,
Right.
okay, I get that all that's possible, and maybe like you said, maybe it's better, and maybe if that's a progression that would make life easier for mothers. And I'm like, again,
Yeah.
I'm
I don't know.
not anti that stuff. It feels foreign to me, and
Yeah.
it takes the human element out. Moving off of the legal thing to more of the spiritual element, I kind of have this thought that I really have not really thought through very well. So forgive me if it's a poor thought, but just as you were talking earlier, I kind of was imagining, as you're talking about the philosophical and kind of and religious, I guess you would say, or values based
Hmm.
spiritual, like however you want to phrase it. I imagine if there was a situation where a person who was not a believer in a higher power, was not a believer, it just was completely anti believing in God or a creator, that kind of thing. If they found themselves facing the creator, they would probably change their perspective pretty quickly on abortion, I would think.
Well, I would imagine so. I would imagine.
So, again, it's something I just thought of a moment ago for the first time. I never really had that thought before, but it seems to me that is the way you chuckled, the way you laughed at that respond to that, like, it seems so obvious that we have a different answer in our world than we would if we were facing a deity that created us. That
Right.
I would imagine that'd be like a oh shit moment,
Yeah.
where um so it does feel like, putting the legal stuff aside, it does feel very much like a spiritual / religious / values kind of thing also, where you would land on that conception to birth or 3 years old in the
Yeah.
singer's case that you're talking about on that spectrum probably does have a lot to do with how much you believe in a god, or a religious faith or whatever.
Well, I think what it provides is clarity on the subject. I think that's what the belief in the creator would provide in this situation. Although I would say that I believe there is logical congruence between the atheistic position and the believer's position when it comes to the importance and the value of human life from the perspective of the whole point of evolution is to propagate life of a species.
Right.
So therefore, the atheistic believer in evolution would believe that it's most important to have as much human life as possible because it's the most rare life that we know of in nature. And again, I want to
Yeah.
represent both positions. I don't want to just represent my own position. It's the most rare thing that we know of. Sentient life is the most rare thing we know of in the entire universe. There's a gazillion bugs and a gazillion reptiles and everything else. But this one thing, scientifically, it's very rare. And as we know from the plague or other things that have happened, it's not necessarily, it could go out, it could go away. And from the eighth, I was watching something, who was it the other day, who was talking about I think they were talking about it from an environmental perspective, what a disaster it would be if we destroyed our planet and we're the only sentient beings in this entire universe. We've robbed the universe of sentience. So so from the atheistic evolutionary perspective, propagating the species is the prime directive. Now, from the creator's perspective, from the believer's perspective, like my own, I look at it and say, well, God created, and the first thing God did when he created humans, he said, multiply and fill up the earth. And, so I mean, we're talking congruence here. We're talking these two things. And so therefore now there's a little bit more of a personal, there's a lot more of a personal directive from the believer's perspective than there is to the, I'm just being loyal to my species by propagating my species. So
what I'm hearing you say is, whether it's because you are a believer in God or you are a person who values human life, either way, and it doesn't matter really which, like the idea would be like, we value human life, kind of what you originally said, like it is a balance between balancing the valuing life and valuing liberty.
Yes, absolutely.
And so people who, and which is odd because, I look at the spectrum. I think there's a spectrum that is, balancing for societies and human beings and everything we do, balancing freedom and liberty versus safety and comfort and convenience, for example. And I find myself on the liberty side of that. But on this particular topic, I would lean on that huge spectrum we went over from conception to 3 years old or birth or whatever. I lean not 100%. I would not put myself in the crowd where 100% at conception. I would put myself a little further along that. But earlier on, 10 weeks, 15 weeks, somewhere in there. So I don't have a number on the top of my head, but it would be easy for me to figure out one if I heard some math on like when is pain felt and when is there a heartbeat. Like I would come to a conclusion pretty quickly. I think I would be more towards the earlier period though. Which is opposite of what I normally think on liberty stuff. Like I think that there is a lot of, but I'm also the guy who says you can smoke all you want until I have to smell your cigarette smoke, and I can weigh 400 pounds all I want until it's time for me to sit next to you in an airplane, and then now you're inconvenient. Like that for me is a thing where like we can all have our freedom right up until the moment it impacts somebody else, and this, in my opinion, is a perfect example that you can do all the things you can smoke and drink all you want right up until you have a baby, because now you're impacting somebody else. And not that I'm saying that there should be a law against drinking when you're, but putting historical context in this, like fetal alcohol syndrome is something I heard about all through health class in 7th grade. Like they were really hammering that stuff, and smoking when you're pregnant are things that were really covered extensively. And it made sense to me because this is a behavior that now is affecting another person negatively. And again, whether that becomes a person at 7 weeks or 32 weeks, at some point it's a person, at some point it's going to be negatively affected by this stuff. I guess I'm just noting that's odd in this case. The liberty and stuff is kind of flipped for me. You know,
well,
because
but it really isn't, Brian. I don't think it consistently. I don't really think it is flipped, because you're talking about two people's liberty that are coming into the most fundamental liberty is the freedom to be free from harm from somebody else.
Right.
That's the most basic liberty.
Sure.
So what you're talking about in this, and it is a unique situation, because these two people are, and I refer to them at whatever point is two people, are in the same body. so you've got, in most cases, it's like, if I don't like Brian, I can move. If the baby, if the mama is doing drugs and the baby's at 6 weeks after conception, baby can't do anything about it. So you've got conflicting liberties that are going against. And this is where, we've been accused of not having enough nuance in our discussion. So let's have some nuance here, right?
Sure.
So this is where the nuance comes in. This is where you have to say that which of these liberty rights, which of these rights to personhood supersedes the other. And this is where, for instance, the argument that I would make at this point is say, look, who is the party in this case that caused the situation? Who's got more responsibility? So liberty and responsibility are going to go together. So we hold people in areas of high responsibility or high authority with more responsibility. In this case, you find that the mother has more responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean that she's a responsible person, or, and this is, of course, where somebody says, well, what about rape and incest? Okay, well, let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I would say just for this conversation, we could carve those out as being special circumstances that would need to be addressed separately.
Yes.
And for the general conversation you and I are having, the idea we're going to get to every variable and every nuance is not likely.
Happen.
Those two, I would just say that I think most people, including myself, and probably you, would have very different perspectives on those situations,
right?
And any others that are specifically like those.
Absolutely.
So I would, let's not get caught up in the 20%.
Right.
Let's
I agree.
80%, right?
The only thing I want to say about it,
I appreciate what you're saying with is not wanting to be is not ignoring the nuance, but those things are like obvious carve outs that whenever there's a person who's disagrees with somebody, they just say, well, what about rape and incest? Like, okay, well, let's not derail it. We'll get to that. I promise. Let's write it down. Let's never forget to get to that. But let's carve out the 80% first and figure that out, right?
Well, and that's the point. In fact, that's the entire point I would make on that. I wouldn't actually talk about the rape, but I say, look, what you do in any kind of systems thinking, any kind of way you're trying to construct a way of thinking about things, is you deal with a majority case first, and then once you've got the majority case and you've agreed to the majority case, we've agreed to the 95% case. Okay, now let's talk about these other things, and let's figure out what makes sense.
Which are not less important. They're just less frequent. So let's get the big blocks first, and then we'll get to the small. 100% agree. Yeah,
it's just good logic, is all. Well, and so that's where I think that's where this discussion has to go. Is first of all, you've got to come up with some shared values, some shared terms, and that's why, again, when we talk about the difference between how the atheist and the theist think about things, well, where can we get to that's a shared place? Where can we get to the propagation of the human species should be a shared thing, whether you believe it's in your responsibility as being a sentient creature, one of the few in the universe, or whether you believe you've got a responsibility to God to propagate his image in you, or. So, and then I think if we get to the point where we acknowledge, and this is where back to the argument, talking about this argument that's taking place and trying to explain it to people in the future. If we say, look, we have to acknowledge, I have to acknowledge that the other side has, the people who believe differently from me on how this should be organized have valid points. I can't just say they're evil. And this is the problem with, I think, a lot of our society today and a lot of our dysfunction today, and hopefully in the future this is solved, is that as soon as somebody disagrees with me on and this is a heartfelt subject because we're dealing with babies. We're dealing with mothers and we're dealing with babies, two of the most sensitive topics in the world. And so therefore, if somebody disagrees with
valuable, by the way, like these are maybe the most important things, and the most important things to talk about is mothers and babies, right?
Absolutely, because you don't have a humanity after that, and maybe you don't have sentience
everything
in the
stops when those
universe.
things aren't addressed.
Exactly right. And so that's why I think if we end up coming to those conclusions and say, okay, you've got very valid concerns, we've got very valid concerns, if you will address those, and let's come up with, and this is where that gets to that sort of governmental thing, is it's not going to be my standard. It's not going to be this person's standard over here. What can we do to advance things in a positive direction? And that's the conversation we can't have today. And that's the dysfunction of our day.
Yeah, I think that kind of the steps I would see that have to happen for this topic to get resolved to the degree it can. And again, I don't think there'll ever be harmonious beliefs on this that would last for more than a few years, just because people, there's a wide range of opinions and drivers to form those opinions, whether they be spiritual, religious, or atheistic, or whatever. The first thing I think everyone has to just reconcile is we're not going to get 350 million people to agree on this.
Right.
And so the notion that one side or the other is going to win and have their ideology adopted by 350 million people, I think that's ludicrous. And everyone just all people have to just like park that and say, stop it. That's nonsense. It's never going to happen.
Right.
And then have some kind of federal, again, in my mind, like 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 15 weeks, somewhere in there where the heartbeat is. Okay, well, if that's 12 weeks, then that would be a whatever the rule, like when they feel pain. Okay, whatever rule it is, we determine that. And then go back to what the founders, again, because I think that they were ingenious in how they crafted things as well. Going back to having limited federal government involvement, so i.e. a person is a person at this point, and it's okay to charge somebody for double murder if they kill a pregnant woman if they're 32 weeks pregnant, but it's also against the law federally to abort children, or, baby, or have abortions, after 16 weeks or whatever it is, right? That makes sense at a federal, that feels like the only thing that they could do to have any kind of congruence in anything. And then going back to the founders being brilliant is that's it for the federal. They're out. Now it goes back to states can decide, do they have abortion or not? And maybe even counties could decide if they have it or not. Or because I think that this is something that you will have areas like you live in the state of Washington. There's parts that are very religious and conservative, and there's parts that are very not. And they live, hours apart from each other.
Right.
Even that might be too much of a stretch for people to be forced to adopt an ideology. It seems like the only way to have people reasonably happy about this, or content, not happy is not the right word, content with the outcome, is to localize the decision-making on the specific legalities as much as possible. So in my mind, like even county, so a state could say we allow it or don't allow it. So fine, let's say Louisiana says we don't allow it and Oregon says that they will. Okay, fine. Well, within Oregon, you might have 7 of however many counties, let's say they have 25 counties.
Right.
7 of the counties might say, yeah, it's okay statewide, but in our county, it's not going to be okay. And because how else could you do this in a way that would allow people to have that balance of life and liberty that you're talking about? And if you want one, drive 4 hours away and get one. Like I hear about the argument about the risk to the mother if they have to drive that far. I don't know the medical stuff well enough to know if that's a real viable argument or not, if that's a legitimate argument, if that's just like a thing that they're grasping at. But what do you think of that, Dave? Is minimal federal standard and then pushing down the decision as much as to the most local level we can, which would obviously either be state or maybe even county. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think on a practical level and on a short-term level, short-term being the next 10, 20 years or something like that, I think that on the practical basis, there should be minimal federal involvement because just based on how we organize ourselves as a nation, there's minimal federal involvement, and then people self-organize based on their ideology beyond that. That's kind of where we're at right now. And that's the best we can hope for right now. And also, I would say that, for instance, if you want to take this argument to way back to the founding, there was another very contentious argument, which was a moral argument, philosophical argument, legal argument. It was called slavery. It
Right.
wasn't that in 1865, all of a sudden we realized that slavery was bad. There was plenty of people at the founding of the nation that said that slavery is an evil, it's abominable. There were people that wanted to exclude it from the Constitution, but they
Yeah.
realized that they couldn't make the Union happen if they did that. Then did it make slavery right? Did the people who compromised, who didn't believe in it, did they compromise their values? Or did they take the pragmatic step of saying, here, we're going to
Yeah.
form this and we're going to move in this direction? So there's people on my side, on the pro-life side, who would say that we're going to not accept, protest anything other than moment of conception, and we won't vote for any incremental progress because it is approving of baby murder. And there are people on the other side that would say, no, we won't accept it. And you see this, it's playing out right before our eyes, that would say, we won't accept any restrictions at all right up into the moment of abortion. And they maybe not say it, but in some places they've said,
Up to delivery, you mean? Up to the moment of delivery.
yeah, I'm sorry, up to the moment of delivery, or maybe a little bit out. There's doctors we've heard of that have said, yeah, if the baby was born, if a botched abortion happened, we wouldn't save it, and they would be free to go. So those are positions that I understand the philosophical consistency of those positions, but I also say that we have to make progress. As you say, of a 330 million people country, we have to make progress to some level of commonality, because otherwise, if there's no level of commonality, you end up with, the 1865 situation again, where brother against brother.
Yeah, and that's I think that would be the flaw in my idea of, county by county, even, or state by state, having different rules, is it does kind of set us up for that kind of 1865 resolution where, or like you've mentioned, countries in Europe that just absolutely hate the Macedonians hate the people in Greece, and for those kinds of things, where maybe my idea would lead to more of that and not less of that. And it kind of feels to me like we would have to fundamentally get back to, kind of, in my mind, I go back to 2007, because there's very clear studies on the change in our culture, in race relations and teen suicide, and different metrics that indicate happiness, right? And how we're thriving and how we're getting along. So in 2007, that's a year that stands out. Like, back then, we kind of had this live and let live kind of mentality, and we would have to have that again.
Yeah.
Versus now, what we have is this mood where it's not my job as a citizen now to make my case, but ultimately let people live how they want to live. It's now my job to educate and maybe force others to come around to my way of thinking.
Yeah.
And I don't know that in this era, the county by county thing would work. It might make things worse instead of better. It feels like we would have to first get back to, so maybe step 1A after adopting this kind of federal, whatever rule, 10 week, 12 week, whatever rule it would be, 15, 16, whatever week. We would have to get back to a place of this kind of live and let live mentality collectively. I don't think we're going to solve this or some of these other issues until that happens.
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, so you've got two levels, like you do in a lot of things. You've got, I think the idea of a common basic floor makes sense. 12 weeks, 10 weeks, 15, whatever. I think, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think, yes, I do think if you made it county by county, that gets a little bit too crazy to manage. But I think if you made it a floor and then state by state for the time being, I think that's the best you're going to get right now. I mean, just pragmatically speaking, and I reckon we have to be good at understanding what we can do and what we can't do, and then from there. But I also agree with you that it's not going to be solved as a governmental thing. It's going to be solved as a societal thing. If the societal mood is not that we could live and let live, if the societal mood is not that here are some common standards, and I'm a little bit more this way and you're a little bit more that way. If the societal mood is not right, then I don't care what you do at the government level, society isn't going to change. So, and I do believe that both sides of these discussions have this idea that if I only control the levers of power, that I can make society into the utopia that I want. And that
Yeah.
is not true. And that's, again, something that folks in the future should realize, that it's not just about the levers of power. It's about the mood, the direction, the flow of society, what society thinks. I have these discussions with people all the time that, you talked about the climate change issue. Well, if everybody did this and this and this and this, I said, sure, if everybody did this and this and this and this, then all this stuff would happen and it would be great. But that's not going to happen. People aren't
Right.
going to do these things because that's not their mood. If you don't take into account the mood of society, then nothing ever gets done.
Yeah, and on this kind of topic, again, and right now we have a very tribal area where both sides have deemed themselves to be the righteous one whose job it is to convince/force the other side to come around. um, in doing that, you are reducing the other person's liberty by definition.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have to strike this balance, and maybe that's why, that's part of what I think is so special about our country, is it forces us to strike these balances. Now, right now, we're failing miserably. I would say collectively, we're not doing very well at this, but that liberty thing matters. And like,
Yes.
Yes, we have a country that was founded on Judeo-Christian values. However, there are certain things that people have to allow to happen that they don't like, because that gives the other person liberty. And
Right.
that's just as valid as the liberty I think that I
Absolutely.
value. And it could be things as simple as alcohol or marijuana use or whatever. Like, just because I would not teach my kids to do certain things, not saying I wouldn't teach my kids those things, but just because I would not teach my kid a certain thing doesn't mean it's bad for everyone else to do it. And this is the fundamental shift that I have felt over the last 15 or so years, is going from this, I wish we lived in a place where, and here's why I think I have this, or why my opinion I think is better, or why my point of view or the facts I have are more, um, urgent or compelling or whatever, versus they need to do what I say or else.
Right.
That is the change that is just, because I mean, the abortion thing's been going on since, like, I don't know, 1932 or 1922 or something. Like, it's not a new thing.
No, it's not new at
And
all.
it's a global thing.
Yep.
It's just, it's the way we're going about, quote unquote, solving the problem, which is the opposite of solving the problem. And that kind of brings up a point. Again, I've not really thought this through, but I'll just ask you, is there any group or entity that benefits from this ongoing conflict that you can think of?
Well,
Because it seems like things we're talking about seem fairly simple. Like, it doesn't seem like it takes a master's degree to figure out, like, what the stuff we've gone through. Like, who benefits from I get that there's doctors who make money from abortion, and I get that there's people who whatever, but who makes money from the conflict continuing?
Well, and this is not even just in this space, of course, it's in all of these different spaces. Whenever you can convince a sizable portion, 10, 15, 20% of society, that these other people over here are truly evil, not that you disagree with them, but they are
Right.
evil. Now, I'm not saying, I believe in good and evil, and so there
Yeah.
is such a thing as good and evil in the world. But if you can convince this group of people over here or this group of people over here, take either side and say that this other group is truly evil, not just wrong, but despicable, horrible, they shouldn't exist, they're
Yeah.
deplorable, whatever you want to call them, then you have a wonderful fundraising opportunity. You make tons of money. When the threat of being associated with these groups, there's been these people that have consulted.
Who makes the money, Dave? Who's making them? Who's doing the fundraising? Who's getting the cash?
Well, of course, you've got constituent groups on both sides that are out basically raising money to do campaigns.
Political Action Committee. When you say constituent group, you mean a PAC? Is that what you're talking about?
PACs, nonprofits, consultants, political consultants.
Okay.
Certainly,
right.
When Roe v. Wade was overturned, that was a windfall opportunity for Democrats to raise money on that decision, because they're coming for the rest of your liberties. It's going to be the Handmaid's Tale and the whole thing.
Yeah.
So whenever there is whenever there is something that comes up that allows you to paint the other side as evil, then at that point you can raise money on that. You can make, there's we talked about several episodes ago the fact that the homeless industrial complex is a multi-billion-dollar operation. I would say that the abortion industrial complex is a multi-billion-dollar operation. I'm sure they could point to folks
and
on
just
my
to
side.
clarify, when you say that, you're not talking about, I'm guessing you're not talking about the doctors actually doing
No.
it. You're talking about the people making money with the fight on either side.
With the fight, exactly.
Yeah, the lobbyists, the PACs,
and that's again back to your point about societal mood. That's the mood of society today. And then in the future, when this kind of whatever the issue is, say 80, 100 years from now, where it's the most contentious issue that they face, you'll know you're in an inflection point if you look and say that the oppositions to each other are not loyal oppositions. They're loyal to the country but opposed to each other on policy decisions, but that they are angry oppositions, and they are such that the other side is painted as truly despicable bad guys. That's when you'll know you're in that societal mood. And when you're in that societal mood, then you try to bring some peace, you try to bring some calm, you still advance what you believe. I still try to advance what I believe, but I'm not going to get into a shouting match with somebody that disagrees with me.
Yeah, and now that you say that, like our second episode, I think, was on race, and one of the things I commented that it seems like the story of humanity, that the conflict between races has either been a tribe or a group believes that they have been given this God-given superiority,
right,
and therefore it's okay to do whatever they want to to these other people, this other tribe, this other group, this other whatever ethnic group or whatever it is. Race, so either we have the superiority because it's a God-given thing, or these people have done us such egregious harm that our retaliation is justified.
Yes.
And that seems like the story of humanity.
Right.
And at the time, it felt like it was applicable to race, and it certainly is. I still think that, but it feels like it's everything. Maybe
it is
like what you're describing is. Once, and again, this happened somewhere probably around early 2000s, 2001. They were calling George W. Bush Hitler and stuff like that. And so on this particular topic, that it maybe happened in the 60s. Like, I don't know. It happened somewhere where both sides became evil.
Yeah.
Like, you're either murdering babies or you don't care about women's rights and whatever. And again, this is a very delicate, nuanced conversation that there's no right answer that will make everyone happy. So anyhow, but both sides painted the other as evil, and therefore whatever we do is justified. And that feels like the fatal flaw to me. That feels like the change that in the era I remember growing up in, where again, there was vehement disagreements on things. I remember going to where my aunts and uncles would be shouting at each other, but they absolutely loved each other. Also, they'd be playing cards an hour later, and life went on, and they just knew that they weren't going to change the other person's mind, and they got to a point where they couldn't talk about things anymore. But they still loved each other, and they still respected each other, and whatever. That apple pie, Norman Rockwell, whatever, in my mind, it was a beautiful thing where you could argue about things and be passionate and try to make compelling arguments to change people's minds for a better world,
right?
But also respect the fact that they have their point of view too, and they have their perspective, and they have things that they're smarter about than me, and I don't have all the answers, and that's the piece that I miss. That in this topic specifically, maybe more than others, that is just showcased. That's highlighted in this topic, where the other side has to be evil, and I hate to think that it's so simple as to come down to the people making money fighting the fight, but the answers seem so obvious to me, or I'm just completely missing the boat, which could be. Like, the things we've talked about seem like such simple solutions, not easy, not the right ones that are going to make everyone happy, but the simple ones, because what other choice do you have?
Right. Well, what other choice do you have? See, that's where it really comes down to. So if you don't compromise with evil. See, this is where it gets to a debate into a war, right? So if you get to the point where you say the other side, I've got some great friends who are very opposite of me ideologically speaking, and they believe things that I think are wrong. and I disagree with him about it.
Yeah.
And we get together around a bonfire and we talk about them, and sometimes voices get raised a little bit. But
Yeah, of
then
course.
after that, it's like, all right, well, we're not going to solve this. We haven't solved it in 50 years. We're not going
Yeah.
to solve it now. And I don't think they're evil, and they don't think I'm evil. And I don't hit them, and they don't hit me. It's all good. So.
Yeah.
So if it got to the point where I said, you're so wrong about this issue that I need to be violent against you. This is like, for instance, again, I'm being a little bit harsher on my side than I am on the other side in some of these things, where when you get to the point where you're bombing an abortion clinic, you're pro-life, yet you're killing an abortion doctor, and you justify it by saying this. Well, you've crossed over from, and so at that point, it's not just money. So there's the cynical that make money on this, that want to stoke the fire because they can fundraise off and they can sell consulting gigs. And then there's the folks that are just radicalized by it and say, and they believe truly in their heart that these people are evil and therefore they do not deserve to live. Even though I'm pro-life, they've done something so bad that offer is not extended to them anymore. And then that's where the pro-choice have a good argument
the
against
retaliation is worth it because they've killed X number of babies, or retaliation is worth it because they've robbed X number of women of their liberty, and they've intruded upon the most fundamental basic liberty we have, which is the privacy between us and our doctor.
Right.
Both sides are playing this exactly as you're describing it.
Yeah.
And again, I hate to be so cynical, but the obvious question I'm asking is, where's the Lincoln to come along and just say, okay, enough of this nonsense. Here's a leader who will fight through that. Or that's why I started out with, like, who's profiting or not profiting, who's benefiting from the fight.
Yeah.
Because that whoever is benefiting from the fight is preventing that Lincoln-esque figure from coming out and saying, here, and again, super simple for me to say, I'm sure there's nuances I'm not, and legal things I'm not getting to, but it seems really simple to me. Like the conversation that you and I've just had in an hour, an FDR style fireside chat, like, where's the guy with the woman? Like, where's the leader to do this? Like, where are they at?
Well, and I think, you look at history, and we're going to talk about some historical precedents. And one time in the future, we've talked about, look at history when things are going relatively good. And even now they're going, physically speaking, this is a great time to be alive. I mean, if you listen to the chatter up here, it's like the worst time in all of human history. I was listening to one of the Styx songs from my youth, and the best of times from their, I can't remember which album it was, but they were talking about, the headline says these are the worst of times. And I was thinking, man, that was 1981. Those were some really cool days, So when society is in this kind of thought where all of this is happening and everything is a crisis, what will get us out of this crisis is when a real crisis comes along. When if we go to war with Russia, China, Iran all at once, if an asteroid comes, if there is a global to make my climate change activist friends happy, if there is a global crisis in a moment that focus when all of our attention becomes
acid rain
focused.
they predicted 1987 finally happens.
Yes, exactly. Y2K comes, whatever. When one of those crises happens,
then we figure it out for sure.
Then we'll figure it out.
Yeah. So I guess the thing I would say to Kenny G listening in his his history class, looking back on this era, when people start talking about the other side as being evil, that is when your spidey sense should be going off. That is when when it's no longer people we disagree with and people who have their perspective and they're allowed to have their thoughts, even though I vehemently think they're wrong and I think my facts are more compelling and I think their facts are BS and all that kind of stuff. They're still allowed to be themselves. When that changes to those people are evil and must be stopped, that's the red flag.
Then watch for it. Yep, exactly right. And that's happened here. That's happened in every instance of human destruction of Mao's China. The Great Leap Forward and all of those things. It happened in Nazi Germany. It happened in so many places where it became less about disagreement and more about these people are truly evil. Again, not to say there's not evil in the world, but to say that the entire side has become evil and therefore they need to be eradicated. That's, yes, your spidey sense should go off then.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we covered all of it. We didn't even get to the medical side of things, and I don't know in the hierarchy of conversations. I don't know where that one really fits. Honestly, I don't know if that should have been the first or second, whatever. I think we've covered as much as we can for now. Certainly, there's much nuance to this, and there's a whole bunch of variables, and people are passionate. There's no question. For those of you listening, we would love to know where you think we got it right and where we got it wrong. Now, we know you're probably not going to, jump in and talk about, well, you guys are misunderstanding the 12-week thing versus the 14-week. That we don't mean that. We want to explain to Kenny G or the people, living, 60, 80 or 100 years from now, what this moment feels like and what the mood is. And that's the part we would really like your help. If you think we missed any of that, if you think we missed the mark on that, please chime in. Go to unsilentpodcast.com to find our social channels. You can find us on Rumble, YouTube here and there, but Rumble for sure, and unsilentpodcast.com. And chime in and tell the people 80 years from now what this moment feels like and how this topic has shifted and changed. And until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.